website later, we can do that. Okay, so we're live, and I'd like to turn it over to Geoffreyjen.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, so thanks for the introduction. Maybe other stuff will come up because I tend to do a lot of different things. I'm a bit of an eclectic creator. But the main reason for this discussion is around the book that I published and the series of books that it will eventually be part of. So the book I published is Plenum, the first book of Deo. It's a science fiction novel about the far future. It's one of my interests. A lot of writers today in science fiction are focusing on the near future because of the trouble we've gotten ourselves into in terms of the planet. But I think that we need as much stories about the far future as we need stories about the near future, because it's only the long-term visions that's going to give us the path out of the difficulties that we've gotten into. So my books are about a long-term future, thousands of years in our future, although there's an issue about the time, as we'll get into. Plenum is the story, is another aspect of the story that's a bit different from what one normally finds. Plenum is it's about a religious community. So it's I've been thinking about this because, of course, somebody like Frank Herbert has written, and we've probably all seen, most of us have seen the new film of Dune done by Denis Villeneuve, and it deals with religion as well. But Herbert's view of religion is almost a view from the outside looking in. And I was interested in exploring religion from the inside looking out, even though I am not, I'm fundamentally an atheist. So it was a big jump for me to sort of jump into this idea of a story about theism and faith, even though I don't necessarily have a background in that area. So Plenum deals with a kind of view on religion as a sort of opening up of ideas about religion. It also deals with gender. The story concerns a young character who is gender neutral. When I started writing the series in 2012, nobody was writing or talking about gender much. I invented 7 genders for my book. And so there are, and I had to invent my own pronouns because nobody was doing pronouns back then. So I use she, here for the pronouns that I use too. So she, Z, he, and hir for the pronouns for my characters. And the story concerns a young novice who forms a relationship outside the community and gets into trouble as a result of it, and then has to deal with the authorities that come down on her about that relationship. It also deals with youth culture, which is another area that I've been interested in. I think, although, of course, young adult books are now very popular, and there are lots of them, I do think our general culture is not very favorable towards youth in general, or doesn't give a lot of power to youth. And that's been a sort of constant interest that I've had as well. Plenum, however, is the first volume of a much larger series of books. I'm a bit crazy. It's a 15-book cycle. 5 trilogies. This is the first volume of the first trilogy. And they're all written and they're being revised for publication. So I'm on a kind of a roll to get these things published at about a rate of 2 a year for the next 10 years, more or less. So and with this is the first one. The second one is in the works for publication late this year, and the third one for publication in the middle of next year. So, and the larger series deals with the questions of technology and how technology changes what it is to be human. That's another area that I hope to explore in more detail. Lisa, do you have any?
Could you tell us a little more about what the 7 genders are? Just give us sort of the run through. You've named them after the notes on the scale.
Yes. So do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti are the 7 genders. I've done some things with language in the book. So I've merged the do, re, mi with the term individual, which I've shortened to indiv. So I put, so the genders are dindiv, mindiv, sindiv, lindiv, depending on which of the do, re, mi gets associated with indiv as a way of talking about them. And essentially what I did, so these are actually 7 sexes rather than 7 genders. It's just that in my world, the gender and the sex aligns together. And there's 7 sexes because there are 2 new sexual organs that are introduced into the human morphine, if you like. The first is a membrane that replaces the genitalia and forms a membrane that either can roll to form a penis or fold to form a vagina. So it's a bisexual organ. And the second new organ is the entire skin becomes a highly sensitive pleasure surface with a much enhanced level of response across the body. And so I have names for those 2 organs. The skin is called a shoud, and the membrane is called a mulin. And so the genders are dindiv is traditional male, and findiv is traditional female. Do, re, rindiv is traditional male with the shoud, with the sensitive skin. Findiv is traditional female. Re, mi, fa. So sindiv is the traditional female with the skin as an extra. And then mindiv is the individual with the foldable membrane, and tindiv is the individual with the foldable membrane and the sensitive skin. So you have these different organizations. Oh, and lindiv is just the sensitive skin. And so there's different arrangements for sexual encounters that correspond to different genders. So it's a rather unusual. I don't know, when I sat down to think about if we had the ability to modify the body, it seemed to me that playing with sexuality would be one of the first things we might want to do. And this is what I worked out. Obviously the 7 genders in a musical scale is a kind of metaphor as well, not just it's a choice,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Do you play around with them in some of the other books?
Yes, so this one concerns the mostly, well, an encounter between the community, a religious community. It's a no, a homosexual community in the sense that it is a single sex. They're all Lindives, and which is the sex that is just the skin surface. And the main character forms a liaison with a Findiv, with a young woman, and that's where she gets into trouble. But in other books in the series, I have all sorts of combinations or explorations of those different characteristics, whether they're Mindivs with the membrane, or whether they're people who are switching from one gender to another um, for reasons that I explore in some of those books.
Yeah, it's also interesting that, even though you weren't thinking of, I mean, you were one of the few people thinking of pronouns and gender issues back when you started writing this. I mean, now it seems like you're releasing it at the perfect time when we're like hyper sensitive to um, sex and gender issues and pronoun and language issues. Um, it's, now's
I
the time.
didn't quite plan it that way. It simply took a long time to write these damn things.
I know how that goes. So another thing that is really different about this, where it's set compared to, a lot of science fiction gets set on other worlds, but, they're basically kind of just like this one, but somewhere else. And they don't worry about, breathing and different environments and atmospheres. But yours is set like out in the vacuum of space. And the characters have to deal with being in a gravityless environment, for one. You also have a few earth animals that have been maybe manipulated genetically to be able to survive in that kind of environment. So tell us a little bit about, what you were wanting to take on by really giving yourself the challenge of trying to imagine what it's like to live in deep space.
Mm. So I probably have maybe overdone it in the sense that I have so many different technologies, and it's a bit of I think a bit of a challenge for readers to understand all the different technologies that are going on, although they do form a kind of organic whole, I think, that one does get from reading the stories. I'm interested, as I say, so why do they have, so this idea of living in a vacuum, I have read, I mean, a number of science fiction writers have written about the idea of surviving for a short period of time in a vacuum. Arthur C. Clarke in 2001, there's the scene where in the film you see the character blowing out of a spacecraft into the other spacecraft, and they spend a few moments in the vacuum. And so you have this kind of thing going on. So it does seem fairly clear that one can survive for a few seconds in the vacuum. And I got to thinking about that, and I thought, well, with the right technology, maybe you could survive longer in the vacuum. And so I started to think through what technologies one might need in order for that to happen. And so I went to things like, for instance, One has there's a series of science fiction. There was a science fiction story and a film that was made of it called Abyss, which was a James Cameron film. And Abyss concerns the deep sea, the underwater. And they replaced the entire breathing apparatus of the divers with a kind of liquid oxygen inside the body. And so I adopted that for my books, because I think if you had a liquid oxygen way of breathing, you wouldn't need to deal with pressure issues in the vacuum and so forth. You could, and I developed a whole system for feeding the way a person breathes through infrastructure that sends small bubbles of oxygen between ports in the environment and the people, that gets taken up by their spacesuits, essentially. They're very, very thin spacesuits. There's another technology that I have invented. I invented it for space travel problems. So I'm a physicist, and I don't believe in faster than light travel. Despite all the stuff that you've seen from Star Trek and all the rest of it, I'm very skeptical that that will ever be a thing that the universe allows to happen. And I'm a kind of a purist about my physics. And so I thought, okay, no faster than light travel in my book. But then if you don't have faster than light travel, you have another problem, which is that you have to send people out for generations on ships. And that's been done a lot. There are lots of books about that kind of experience. And the books end up being about that experience, the generational ship, rather than the interactions between people. So I thought, no, that's a no-go too. So what I decided to do is to introduce a technology that allows one to slow time. And if you can slow time, you can go across the stars and back, and you haven't aged very much. And even the people at home, if they slowed their time appropriately, would also not necessarily age much. And so I introduced this idea of slowing time, and it radically changed the way people live, the way people function, the way they deal with time. There's just managing the different time scales becomes an issue. And then the consequences of, if you could slow time, means you would change the way physics acts on the body. And so you could soften the effects of the vacuum on the body, for instance. So if you slow time when you're in a vacuum, you can soften the effect of cold or excessive heat, become less extreme. And so you can play with these kinds of technologies in terms of, so it's a way of applying my own physics background to some fairly extreme ideas about what the body could do if one had the right technologies to do it with. Not sure if that's clear.
I'd like to back up for a moment. I'm not wherever we are and wherever we're going. With the, you said you called the do, re, mi, fa, so, you said you think of it not as gender, but as sex, or which? These are different genders.
So it has to do with the way, because the language about this has changed in the last 10 years. So nowadays we consider gender to be socially determined,
right,
and sex to be biologically determined. And since my characteristics are essentially physical characteristics, they really are sexes.
Okay.
And then their gender follows, because in this world, gender and sex can be aligned. You change sex in order to get the right gender. And so you don't have as many need to have different gender from the sex that we have today.
My question it with a little bit of a Jungian spin. Certainly in our psychological discussions, and it's actually a very simple question I will try to get to as efficiently as possible. But in Jungian psychology, the difference, and let's say opposition between the differences, and in this case, in your book, we've got multiple differences, but how these differences meet, converge, either resulting, let's say, in procreation as one thing, or reproduction as one thing, or psychological development as another thing, experiences of a unification among ontological importance. Then, and just with your 7, what is the consequence of their relationships?
So that's a very good
In other words,
question. Sorry, let you finish.
I'm finished.
Okay.
With that question, I've got other questions, but I'm finished with that one.
It's a very good question. So I mean, I haven't read Jung deeply, but I've read Jung, to a certain level, and I understand the animus and anima and those kinds of concepts. Do these people have a different psychology? Yes, I think they do, and that's partly, I think, although it's taken me. It took me a lot longer to tease that out of the story ideas. So I have been struggling a lot with the physical aspects, and the psychological aspects of what's going on have been harder to get clarity in terms of what's going on. But I have started to tease that out. So, and maybe I'll get something out of the discussion today that could go back into the books about it. Obviously, I am moving away from a polarity in the way the books, the way, although ultimately, I mean, in some sense, the masculine is this entry into, and the feminine is the reception. And I still have those things. It's just that they're organized differently in the organs, right? But the psychology that goes with that, I think one would expect that there would be some important shifts. Exactly what those shifts are, though, I'm not sure I can say right now. Even though I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I think the fluidity. So my own interest in talking about gender in these books is because I myself identify myself as gender fluid. It's why I've changed my name from Geoffrey to Geoffreyjen, which incorporates the name Jennifer into my first name, Geoffrey. So I think this multiplication of the genders allows more fluidity between, and I think what we're seeing today is a burgeoning of fluidity in terms of the way people understand gender, sex, and how they relate to each other. So we're less locked into this idea that one is either masculine or feminine, one is either male or female. One is more fluid. So maybe the anima and animus are more fluid as well.
It's interesting. There are species that have many more than 7 sexes.
Yes, there are some with hundreds, indeed. Yeah.
So so I think the book makes sense to follow that trend of thought, and why are we limited to? Why have we been limited to 2 for so long?
Exactly. Especially if I mean, obviously, playing God with the human condition is maybe fraught with danger. But we've been doing it for a while, haven't we?
We've been certainly gender fluid for a long time. It's just not, it was not in the discussion
It wasn't in the language either. Yeah.
or in the language. And so it was, so a lot of people in history have had great difficulty in describing themselves.
Yeah.
Well, that's just in our culture. There are, from what I understand of American Indian, some American Indian cultures, they have the notion of the two spirit. Like somebody has two spirits in them, like a masculine and a feminine spirit. And then in the Indian culture, there's what's known as hijras, which are basically males who are most likely homosexual, but definitely transvestite, who have been given, usually, a homosexual male is not very well looked upon in that rather masculine based culture, but these particular people have a specific like spiritual and ritual function within the culture. So it's like they found a niche for them. So I don't know. I wish I knew more anthropology. Those are the only two examples that I can think of off the top of my head.
But it is true that in my books, especially this one, but also several of the others, I make a connection between gender and spirituality. Gender expression is a form for me of spirituality.
I was just I was gonna think what you were saying before. It reminded me of what Foucault wrote about the Greek culture, that at a certain point in a young adolescent's life, the male would be a sexual partner for his teacher, his older teacher. And as long as he did not maintain that role beyond a certain number of years, he would not be treated as a homosexual, which was not a good thing in that culture. So the homosexuality was kept within restrictions, but it was widely accepted within that age restriction, and that I also heard from a friend in Iran that was pretty common in Iran, that even to an older age, there were homosexuality that was okay until you were married, and it was like a graduation. So that was interesting on your original idea.
Okay, that's very interesting.
There's also something different about this particular community, the spiritual community, in that the children are not conceived exogenously. It's the siblings are all from like the same genetic pool, sort of like if you had in vitro, but they're raised
In a crib, yes.
Yeah.
So the way I formed the sexes, I left the dindiv, the original male and the original female, and the slightly modified male and female fertile, but had the other ones become infertile. So the mixed genders are infertile, and so they have to reproduce using external means, for which technologies were developed in this context. And you should probably get me to stay away from the physics, because as you've noticed, when you ask me about physics, I tend to get very technical because I'm a scientist and I like that kind of stuff. But I want to talk about the culture and the linguistics and the gender and the poetry and those things more really than I want to talk about the science. So
Well, hold on just a minute. Because that was my next question, pertains to aging. You referred to aging. I'm not exactly sure what it was you said. I don't even remember. I'm sorry.
Tempo. You can change the,
Well, right, we were
the
talking about
time.
changing the tempo of aging, but they're still aging, and I'm just curious how entropy fits, how you work with that, and then also in our psychological context, the sense that moving through time and aging is related to changing. Certainly in the Jungian world, we talk about the process of individuating, but that which means something happens through time, shall we say, although that sense of time can be just as you've made it, fluid. But in your world, what are the effects of aging in the lives of these characters, and how does entropy play into the whole thing, the whole scenario?
Can I add another side note to this? Not just aging, but maturing.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say, but wasn't getting to.
yeah, sure.
Okay.
It's a great question. So I have assumed, I again thought hard about what I wanted to do with this. I have assumed that death eventually catches up, that there you have these technologies to prolong, which will allow life to be prolonged. But I've assumed that death eventually catches up. I've fixed the general lifetime of my people in this era at about 2.5 centuries, which is still way longer than our time, but has an ultimate cutoff on it. So I've assumed essentially that the what do you call it, the transmutation, mutation, those kinds of things eventually causing too many errors to form in the way that cells maintain themselves, and they break down, and that's why you have this eventual death. So
maybe in a vacuum they don't break down as there's not as much friction in the atmosphere.
but they still process oxygen. I mean, breathing is still there. It's just handled differently, and so.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think they do age, and there are questions of maturation. I have assumed, for instance, that there's a system for deciding. So there's no central government in this kind of civilization. Government is one of the things that kind of falls by the wayside. And instead, there is a kind of internet-like commonality that manages things. There's a system behind it, but there's a system by which young people are monitored, and eventually some sort of AI decides, maybe supervised by other people, decides that a young person is mature enough to be treated as an adult. And so, but it's not necessarily a fixed age for everybody. It depends on each individual. So I've got that's an indication of maturation at the young level, right? And then you have various gradations. One of the things that happens when you have these long lifespans is that because relationships don't necessarily last I mean, they do last, but will a relationship last more than 200 years? So there's a kind of volatility about family. And obviously, if you've not just got 3 or 4 generations the way we have today, but you have 10 or 12 generations in a lifetime. And so if you had to keep track of all your great grandchildren, it would become impossible. So there's a reduction of the importance of family as a result of the volatility of these situations. So so I've worked through some of these issues, but not all of them.
It sounds like one of the problems you have to solve with this longevity is the idea of boredom. I don't know how you've solved or how you plan to solve boredom. That is a problem. That is a problem for human beings as even now.
Yeah, so what I have done, this is another of the driving forces in the structure. So because one can modify one's body to live in really extreme environments, they live in hard vacuum, but part of the book, Plenum, the characters descend inside a star, which is again another extreme environment. Now they do so under very special circumstances, but and so what happens is people are drawn to live in more and more extreme environments precisely for this problem of handling boredom. So they leave planetary surfaces and they start to migrate into the atmospheres of gas giants and ring systems where they can live out in these extreme but very beautiful environments because they're drawn to live in circumstances that are much more extreme. So there's a shift in the way a culture develops in this context.
Yeah, so it's like torture in a sense that you have to keep going to reach the next stage of difficulty. In a sense, torture is not the right word, but it's like a track that you have to run, and you have to make yourself able for the next stage and the next stage and the next stage.
Yeah, it is balanced by the other part of this. I mentioned that sort of governments have dropped away a bit, but there is also a focus. So the idea is the very basic functions of eating, defecating, drinking, even breathing are almost taken care of, and you don't have to worry about them. So you don't have to struggle to survive. And so what replaces it is the playing of games. Well, the same old anxieties that we've already got, because those don't go away. And the interest in the long-term survival of humanity as a whole. So what comes out of this is a focus not just on the individual and their own development, but on the way the individual contributes to the development of humanity as a whole. And that becomes a driving force in this. It's partly why I call this a almost utopic kind of context, although I'm very aware that there are dark sides to this utopia, right? So, yeah.
So I've got a couple of questions coming out of this discussion. One of them, so you mentioned maturation and there's attaining mat status, as you call it in the book. I was, given that this was a religious community, I was a little surprised there wasn't more of a ritual kind of initiation process that one had to go through to get that, beyond, to mature, to get mat status. And then the second question, kind of following up on John's question about aging and about individuating, is whether there would be like other maturation status levels to get to and surpass to get to another stage. I mean, if the people are living 2.5 centuries, presumably just your initial adolescence to adulthood wouldn't be sufficient. There might be adulthood 1 and adulthood 2 and adulthood 3.
Midlife crisis.
Yeah, so the first question, hang on, is the
Ritual, mat
the ritual and the religious community. So the way I understood, so the mat status is universal across the whole of humanity, not just this community. And so I kind of assumed when I was writing this that mat status was something that was managed outside the community anyway, and they couldn't really completely replace it. And so they accommodate it within their structure. And where they have rituals is when you enter as a novitiate, when you enter into the full status in the community, but it's not mat status. It's a different stage. And it's discussed in the book because there's a whole discussion where, anyway, it's maybe not quite disconnected fully from mat status, but there is a distinct entry into the community there with its rituals, right? So that's it. So it's a sort of partially overlap. The thing is, you've only got this one book to see it right now, and so the two are slightly confused. The next one, but one will have a much more developed look at the issue of mat status.
Max status.
Maturation.
Maturation.
Oh, mat. Okay, mat status. All right, I was hearing max status. On this issue of the religious element, first of all, I'm really enjoying this, Geoffreyjen, discussing these structures with you. I find it very intriguing as to how you live your life as the creator of worlds, and we can talk about that later. But you started out by saying that the religious factor or coefficient is central.
Faction. Actually, this might be a good place to if it's appropriate with his question to take up the idea of the factions that you invented as well. But can continue on.
I just is the religious aspect configured or congealed primarily as sort of a cultural phenomenon, as sometimes religion is viewed as a cultural artifact, or is in your own imagination, is there a relationship with a numinous force?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I could go on with that one for a while.
Well, have at it.
So to start with the factions. So I have in this idea that the culture is the extant culture is fascinated with the idea of the future of humanity and how does the individual contribute to that. I have assumed that they would form into factions, and that factions correspond to different visions of how the future should be arrived at. And I've formed 5 main factions, which are the 5 trilogies, actually. So the first faction, the most important faction, is Umafax, which is the faction of artists, but it's basically most of humanity is umafax, because at this stage, in order to deal with boredom, you're going to be creating, because that's the sort of motor for dealing with boredom. So most people are going to be involved in some sort of artistic activity. And those who believe that the artistic approach is the way to deal with the future become umafax. The second group in terms of importance is the engfax. Engfax are the technologists, the engineers. They think it's all about technology, and we have to improve our technologies in order to get to a more interesting future for humans. And there may be, I think, of umafax is sort of 40% of humans. Engfax is something like 25%. And then you have ecofax, which are the ecologists, who believe that we need to think in systems terms. You have deofax, which are the mystics and the religious, who believe that we need to think about the future in theological terms.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
And then the fifth faction is one I kind of invented on this situation for those who think that one needs to think about the future in terms of paradox. And they're the smallest group.
There's hope for my kind in the future yet. All right.
So the paradoxalists, who are called Idofax, so the whole thing is called the Ido Chronicles, so there's a link there. The Idofax are the smallest in number, but the most influential in terms of their ability to, because in a sense, the paradox approach drives the whole system. And so they become the sort of motors of change in the system. But Deofax is, say, 10% of the population, total population, believes that the future needs to be done thought through in terms of the numinous and the development of the numinous. So that's sort of one way that the whole issue of Plenum is the first book of Deo. There are 3 books of Deo, so it's in the trilogy. So it's the first look at that perspective within the larger framework. Now, that said, that's not the way religion and spirituality doesn't cover the whole game, because your other questions are relevant. And so I think my broader understanding is that I'm a bit, I read Teilhard de Chardin as a young man, and I'm very oriented towards that kind of approach. So I think in terms of a movement towards greater divinity over time as one moves forward, as the whole system moves forward. And that there's a kind of emergence of some numinous entity over time. However, in my book, there's no one way to do it. There are several parallel strands that each seem to be forming their own numinous structures, but they're different from each other. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's like there are several gods being born over the course of this thing, and they don't all line up. I'm not sure. I don't know why it happened that way. It's just the way I'm built.
It sounds like you've got a lot of room for conflict there with the multiple sexes and multiple sex and the technologies. It sounds like the paradoxalist might not have too much chance. Just to pick one out.
It is a utopia, however. So
And their lives are paradise.
the violence is a present thing, but it comes into play in a number of places. In a lot of ways, I sort of decided when I started that maybe I wouldn't give it too much play, and it took on more as the story went forward. I partially base some of my stories on the Greek legends, the Greek myths, and I shouldn't have been surprised that the Trojan War emerged on the way. So there is a kind of Trojan War that comes into play at one point in this.
I'm glad of it.
So what motivates, I'll take that tack. What's the motivation amongst all of these groups? As you said, it is for this emergence of a ongoing creative advance of humankind.
Well, it seems to me like you're taking up the notion of finite games and infinite games. And so when humanity finally comes to realize that we're playing an infinite game, meaning we're living in order to ensure the continued living of humanity, as opposed to living in order to win or come out on top. I mean, there are finite games, which are about winning and losing, that we play within the infinite game. I would maintain that right now our politicians have gotten kind of confused, and they're playing the infinite game as if it's a finite game. But it sounds like humanity, by the time we get to the era that you are describing, has figured out and is once again living for the infinite game.
I think my understanding is if you took care of the struggle to survive, I think the finite game is largely driven by the needs of survival, and that once the needs of survival fall away, one is almost necessarily in an infinite game. The finite game will rear its ugly head from time to time in pockets, but the larger picture will stay within the larger frame. That's the way I've written this.
Yeah, I think I would agree that once some of the things that drive the struggle for survival are gone or taken care of, we're opened up. David, do you want to?
You've read the Foundation series?
I have.
Okay, so that's kind of the premise of the Foundation series, is that this is an infinite game, but from time to time, the finite game shows its ugly head and has to be dealt with in some way or other, depending on circumstances.
And interestingly, Asimov also had more than one way of seeing this unveiling or development of humans. So the Gaia planet is one way, and it's not the only way, right? So there you have the the second foundation and all that, which is another way of thinking through it. Mine is very Asimovian in terms of style. In fact, I probably reread the Foundation at least 6 times. It's one of my, although I find the writing slightly annoying sometimes, Asimov's writing. It's a very simple style of writing, but the ideas are super.
So one of the things you do introduce in Plenum is what's kind of like a third testament. I forget what you call it.
Yes. It's called the Third Testament. Yes.
Yeah. And you have some very pithy quotes from it. You start.
Yes, I've actually written it.
Oh my God!
Not all of it. I have
Got it.
a book about I've written an origin story about the development of the Third Testament. And I've written a sizable chunk of the content of the Third Testament. So I'm able to quote from it extensively.
Explain.
So the Third Testament, the idea is it's written to 1,000 years before the events that are recounted in the story, but 1,000 years after our time.
Mhm.
And it's an individual who received channeled sayings, a bit like the Seth, I can't remember what that was called, but sort of,
Yeah, there were a whole series of books of
yeah, so
not the Sethians, the Gnostics, but the Seth, that lady who channeled
Roberts,
Seth recently.
what's her name?
yeah, anyway, this idea of receiving a transmission from, and in this case, it comes from interstellar space. So there's a set of texts that this person composes that they claim comes from these trance states with the void. And these texts they're post-Christian in the sense of the First and Second Testament, but they also embrace all the other religions. There's a sense where the book tends to provide bridges between the different religions and tie them all together into a single overall picture. And so it becomes the de facto Bible, in a sense, for all the mystic elements of the society. The 10% who are deophax, but also many of the others who are not necessarily part of the deophax faction, but have read the Third Testament because it's part of their background, right?
Well, I think that's gonna be a separate, that'll be like the bonus book if you buy all 15 as a set.
I have a question. How are you going to avoid the Brave New World syndrome, where everything is run pretty perfectly and there's there's a little bit of conflict, it sounds like, but not very much. It's a utopia, but most utopias are, well, it goes back to the question of being boring, but it also, uh, if you have a human, and it is human, then then the idea of becoming better than the next human, and I think I get the sense that the competition isn't present in your utopia.
So there are different forms of competition present. I mean, the faxes, to some extent, provide different perspectives, and they are, in some sense, competing with each other, right? And there is a court system in relation to the fax system, so there are a way of dealing with conflicts in a legal sense as well. There are aliens in my world. It's another issue that I have, another bone to pick with scientists, with my fellow scientists, that they tend to look for aliens in the same places that life grows on Earth. I think if we meet aliens, they're likely to be very different from the ones from life forms that we encounter on Earth. And so in many cases, I've only about 4 or 5 alien species, but in most cases, they were encountered for hundreds of years before anybody realized they were intelligent. Because they don't show up that way on the radar in terms of intelligence, they have very different way of functioning. So there are these different alien species as well that are present in the context. It's another thing I may be wrong, but I don't think there are millions of alien races in the galaxy, but in my book there aren't. There are just a few. But the Brave New World syndrome of, so I say it's a utopia, but I've started to think of it more as a heterotopia than a utopia. A heterotopia being the idea of a civilization in the process of change. And in a sense, the events that are counted in the entire 15-book cycle happen at a time of transition in the development of humanity. And it is in the process of changing into something that becomes radically different than what we are today, which is what one sees up to this point. And so it sits on the crux between something that is going to, so that's my way of getting around the Brave New World problem, if you like, if that answers your question.
What about the animals and the plants in the 2,000 year from now future? Are there, do animals?
In deep space.
So this was Lisa's question earlier that I didn't answer. So I had to think about this, what would happen with animals and plants. And what I worked in was the idea that humans, when they go into space, end up adapting certain species to function as servants in a way, but servants not in the sense of individuals working for humans, but whole ecosystems that are designed to favor human development. And so rather than adapting a single species, they adapt whole ecosystems. And then I sort of thought this through, and I thought, well, you know, I've already got a lot of things going on in my books. Maybe I should simplify things a little bit. So I have I have focused on a few species rather than, you know, multiply them up, because it's already such a complicated thing. So in Plenum, some of the plant species are the same and some of them are different. And in the different books, one sees different, these things are sort of discussed to some extent, why they're the same and why they're different when they are. But in Plenum, I have whales who have been adapted to function as spacecraft in the interstellar void, and which is a kind of an extreme engineering thing, but anyway, yeah. And octopuses also function in the void, and with suitable adaptations, but in and around space stations. And so, and you have a few creatures like that who've been adapted to function in ways that are supportive of humans. Now, the whole issue, the whales, becomes an issue because in principle, they agreed and consented to this, but in practice, the consents may not have been all the way down, and issues start to emerge. So
it reminds me of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
yeah.
With the whales. And then you have the AI, which is driving everything.
Yes, well, I've worked on AI, and I'm not a fan. I think AI is going to go places that are interesting, but nowhere near where the hype suggests that it's going to go. I don't think it's going to replace human consciousness, human practices in any systematic way anytime soon, and I'm not even sure it'll ever happen. And my books reflect that. That is to say, AI plays a role but it's always in a context where there's some sort of human supervision involved. It's not just AIs working on their own. And they're not central to the way the story works. I'm more interested in the biotech and the nanotech than I am in the AI.
Yeah.
But it's good to have the equivalent of like Google glasses to get around.
Yes, well, yeah, the bin app is.
bin app, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking about various other, I mean, we could go forever in questioning you about your ontology, but I'm wondering about, and just how things may be playing out or how you play with them. Well, play itself would be one, and that is the function of play, but also, beauty, ecstasy, joy.
Oh, that's right. You didn't mention the faction, the hedonist faction.
Yeah, there is a hedonist faction. There are actually two. There's Narfax, which is narcotics fax, and there's Zero Fax, which is a kind of an anti-fax. Yeah. And there are also people who opt out of the whole system, who are called primes. So individuals who opt out.
Walked out?
Who opt out.
Opt out.
Yes,
Okay.
refuse
Yeah.
to take part in any of the structures.
Okay, and where do they reside then? How do they reside in the system?
Well, they hang on the edges, as it were, or they hang on to somebody else, whatever, something like that. They have different arrangements depending on. It's a small thing, but there are some examples in the stories.
They live deep in the mountains of Colorado.
I think primes are an important part of human life. People who don't want to take part in the structures for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Well, there are those.
Yeah.
And like you said, they're deep in the.
Or Big Sur, you know?
Yeah. Opting out.
Yeah.
Sure.
So how to just turn, actually, I don't think we've dealt with this all that much, but your own creative process. I mean, I get a strong feeling for the complexity here, for the scales of magnitude, if you will. You said you want to stay sort of away from the physics per se, but but in your own process, I mean, for me, I would think, oh my God, I couldn't keep track of all these aspects and synthesize them and create this. How do you experience that process?
I'm not sure I can answer that.
No.
I'm sort of aware of, I think it was Frank Herbert who said, you load the bases. So you layer in different, and that's the way I do it. I write a draft, then I layer in a second draft into the first one, and then I layer in another layer in order to deal with these different levels of complexities. As a method, that's what I have. I have hundreds of pages of notes of the different elements that I'm dealing with. When I started, I could keep track of it all, but it's gotten to the point now where I can't hold it all in my head. And so even when I start to work on the revisions for a book, I kind of have to plunge myself into it for a couple of months before I even know where to start with the revisions of that book, because there are so many things that I have to keep track of. But you know, the whole project is at a fairly advanced state at this point, so that, and there are other people involved in the revisions now. So I get good feedback from a variety of people about the work, the novels each time they come forward, and then I work from the revisions from those comments that I get back in order to make them worthy of being published. I think Plenum went through that process. It went through at least 5 or 6 major revisions. The next one along has probably been through 3 or 4. And the one after that is through 2 or 3. So I'm hoping that I'm getting the process shorter as I go, but
Is it a place you'd want to spend your life in? I don't mean imaginatively. I mean, well, yes, that, but can you imagine spending your life in your particular heterotopia and enjoying it? Is it what you conceive of as being a kind of perfect place for an evolving humanity?
interesting question. Would I want to live there? Not sure.
Well,
Well, you constructed it.
Well, let me ask a slightly different question. Why, ultimately, why did humanity choose that, the approach in your book, and on how mankind evolves to get there? And is it the only alternative to evolution of humanity?
Yeah, so I mean, it starts with this idea of if you had biotech and nanotech and AI, let's say, sufficiently developed that you could take care of feeding ourselves, eliminating waste, breathing, or whatever, all those basic stuff, then what do we do? So I don't think the way I propose is the only way to go forward, but I certainly think it is commensurate with that setup as a possible, and I don't know whether it's likely, but it's certainly a possible.
So is there still humanity on Earth?
Earth is a park at this point, because most planetary surfaces have been abandoned. People mostly live in interstellar space, humans, cities in space rather than on land or underwater or things like that.
Because they must? Or
no, because they're drawn to environments that are more extreme, more intense. And I've assumed in a way that interstellar environments have that quality of being more intense. That may be wrong, but it's a choice that I've made in terms of the development.
As a means of evolution, what's the motivation?
As a means of personal growth too.
Yeah. Okay.
Right now we just have extreme sports. That's like extreme life.
I think most of it would be attracted to a society where one didn't have to struggle to survive. Perhaps it would depend on what the price was for having that environment, but I think we might be reasonably attracted and take a careful look at what the costs were and make a judgment about it. So
I would be concerned about boredom, like John was saying earlier, is that the motivation is important to, it's how do we self-development, what motivates each of us in self-development and gets us to where the elements of this book take place, or these 15 books take place.
you know, all you retired guys worrying about boredom, what you gotta do.
No, I'm
okay,
not worried about it.
is-
I don't have time to think about that. But
is write books. You really
Yeah, but I started before I retired.
I think the hard thing for a science fiction writer is to straddle the here, the humanity that's here, and to keep what's familiar or enough familiar so that you can get drawn in to the other world and this different humanity that, but you can still relate. So you've got the commonality and you bring it to this other place and this other type of human, but there's enough that we care about what happens to these people. So I think that would be the hard part, right? Am I right? Is
Well
that the
said. Well said. Yes, that is definitely. I hope that I've achieved that. I feedback I get back is.
Oh, I cared about the characters, absolutely.
Back to a nitty-gritty question, just because I'm intrigued, but is this development of the work and in your writing process, and I kept thinking of pattern and the interweaving of all of these patterns, to put it that way, that's the way I'm putting it. Is this all in your mental process? Do you use charts, graphs, spreadsheets, diagrams? Do you use any of those tools to keep track and stimulate? Or how do you do it?
Yeah, I have on my wall in my room a map of the galaxy that's permanently there, so that I know where I am in the sort of, because the humanity occupies a part of the galaxy that's about 10,000 light years in one dimension by 15,000 light years in another, and 3,000 light years in the third dimension, which is a big piece of space. But for the galaxy as a whole, it's still a relatively small part of the galaxy. So I have a map that I keep track of where I am. I mean, Plenum is one place, but the other books are all across the map in different places, right? I use mind mapping tools to keep track of some of I outline in mind mapping tools often, because it's a useful way to sort of quickly jot down ideas and link them together in ways that are interesting. I have diagrams for places, spacecraft, whatever, cities. I have maps for those kinds of things. In Pinnacle, which is the third book, takes place in a city. This is the one we turned into a 20-minute opera. And so we built a 3D version of the entire city and have detailed, so that the background in my screen here is a scene taken from that 3D representation of the city. So we have visualization tools. Because I was a researcher, I was able to use my books as a kind of ground for developing some things. And so we developed a number of visualizations, I guess you might call it, for different parts of the story. So I use lots of different tools for that. I write in Scrivener. I don't know if you know Scrivener, but it's a writing tool that has a great support for research notes. So it's a way of keeping, and what I like about Scrivener is I have all 15 books in the same place. So I can move from one to the other and back and look at the research and how it connects to the characters. It's all in one place rather than many different files. I'm not sure if that answers it.
That did.
Understand.
So with things taking place in space in such a huge way, and space being, unlike Earth, which has a gravitational field that gives us a particular perspective. Space kind of allows for aperspectivity, and I'm wondering if you play with, like aperspectivity in either just a literal way or a Gibsonian way.
Again, I think the paradox facts is kind of where that's maybe focused in a parallel way. The second book in my series is called Messioff, and it is the first book of Ido, which is the first book in this paradox that takes starts to take a look and untangle the pieces of paradox in terms of a life lived, a civilization as it evolves, the perspective of the different peoples about what's going on. So yeah, I explored those kinds of things very, very consciously, in a very aware way. Yes.
I hope your book comes out before mine is in final production, so that if I need to incorporate anything into it, I can.
It's in Marco's hands right now, so yeah.
So your own sense of the values of what you are doing, and you sort of spoke to this to begin with in your discussion of being drawn to the distant future rather than the near future. And then I get a real feeling, at least something of a feeling of your creative process, and you speak of your world, and I'm also very interested in the move into operatic space, but anyway, I need to keep this to one question. How do you actually feel the sense that this fiction writing, and that was our stated theme, wasn't it? It was that this fiction writing has an importance and a value. How do you experience that importance and that value?
Well, that's a very good question too. I am aware that this is what they call grand narrative, and there is a kind of general argument against grand narrative in our current culture. So I feel that I'm going to some extent against the grain in this kind of writing. It was kind of stuff that was done 30, 40 years ago, and people are doing it less today. But I'm drawn to that kind of writing, and it's in my nature. So it's interesting. I have a number of projects on the go. This one, I have some other fiction projects on the go, and I also have some science writing on the go. And I had to sit down and look at the different projects and say, which one has priority over the others? Because I can't do them all at once, and maybe not do them all ever. And I decided that this was more important than the others, including a project dealing with science. I feel that the way to deal with the issues that humanity is faced right now, is through fiction. I think, or poetry even perhaps, but certainly in the cultural arena and not in the scientific arena. And so I feel that even though I have something interesting to say in the scientific arena, my contribution potentially would have more impact in this arena than in that one. And then it becomes a toss-up between my different writing projects. But this is the first one that I had, and it's the largest and most important one. So it's still the one that I'm most interested in. And it brings in all the different aspects of my interest. Eileen, you were talking about silence, or they were talking about silence and poetry. Poetry is huge for me, and I have, although Plenum doesn't have a lot of poetry in it, it has a bit of it. But in many of the other books, poetry comes into it in substantive ways. So I'm as interested in those aspects of the writing as the more straightforward fiction aspects as well.
Yeah, I mean, in this particular, in science fiction, you can bring in a whole lot of different areas that don't generally come into normal fiction. You know, like I'm thinking about Ursula K. Le Guin, and she, you know, her father, Alfred Kroeber, was an anthropologist, and like her approach to creating new cultures and new worlds seems kind of anthropological, and in one of her later books, she creates a whole culture, including its recipes, its music, its poetry, its you know, just all the different aspects. And so there's an opportunity to be creative in all kinds of different ways, and one of yours I want to also mention is fashion design. And when you launched your book, you had tell people about that, about how,
Well, I could
you know, the overlay and
post, hang on, see if I can find it quickly. YouTube. Anyway, maybe I'll pass it on to you after, Lise, and you can pass it on. So
Okay.
It's a series of video clips that we did an event the 23rd of April this year, where we built, well, so we constructed 4 belts. They're about this wide, that a person wears, and they represent different scenes from Plenum, from the book Plenum. The surface of the moon, the surface of the sun, a fractal design in one case, and a nebula in another. And they are used as anchors for augmented reality software, which then picks out the pattern of the belt and projects onto the person who's wearing the belt scenes taken from the books, 3D animated scenes. So a space station, some of the whales, the Jonas that are swimming around, a space station sitting above the sun as it goes through a flare. And so all of these things were done in a fashion show. So I'm crazy. This stuff comes out of me.
Now, what does this lead us to the opera? How did the opera happen?
Yeah, so the opera is an interesting thing. It was fairly early on in the development before I'd written the whole set of books, but I had a good chunk done, and I encountered some researchers at the university, and they said they had a project to develop an opera. They didn't have a script, and they sort of wanted to know if I might have a script. And I said, oh, I think I could come up with a script. And they had the singers, the composers, the team. And so we put in for a grant. We got a fairly substantial grant to develop a small opera with the team. And so it took us about 2 years to develop a 20-minute opera based on the 3rd book of the series that I'm in the process of publishing. And there is a site on my website, which is hang on, I'll put it into the chat. Geoffreyjen Edwards. Geoffreyjen Edwards. Words.com. If you go to that site and you join the site, you get access to the video clip of the opera, which shows you the full 20 minutes. It was done as a virtual opera, partly for cost reasons. We had designed it to be done live, but to do it live it would have cost quite a bit more than we had. And so we ended up doing it as a virtual opera. But it's still an interesting exercise.
Yeah, I'd love to look that up. I want to see that.
So there's an interesting aspect of the community, to go back to the book. This particular religious community oversees a star nursery. Could you talk some more about that from your astrophysics hat, with your astrophysics physicist hat on?
Sure. So, I mean, there's a lot of astrophysics in my books because it's another area that I love. Yeah. So, so the society, the humanity as a whole operates with a kind of extended internet, if you like, that straddles the stars, and it's supported by a field that is anchored to stars. I had to invent a new force to justify the field, so I call them particles. So it's not non-standard physics, let's say, but there's a low energy field that crosses the stars, anchored to certain stars. And so in order to update the anchoring, they have to modify the structure of certain stars. And so the religious community in this context lives inside a star cluster and contracts with the larger organization for humanity to seed new stars into the star cluster that could serve as anchors for this infrastructure. And so their job is to go down into stars and modify or throw down gravity generators and magnetic generators and things like that into the structure around a star in order to modify it. But they actually go down into the star in order to do this. And they do that using this tempo technology that softens the effects of the extreme heat and pressure and gravity. So non-standard physics, but everybody does it. They call it warp drive. Yeah.
I just want to, I don't want to make it seem like we here sitting around the table at McGowan House are, the only ones who can ask questions. All of you out in Zoom land, if you have a question, about any of the topics we've been talking about, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
I don't necessarily have a question, but during this, listening to you all, it just blows my mind on, and I had to try to comprehend as much as I could, listening through all this. But the minds that y'all have, but there's so many different ideas, your creativity, like, I just can't comprehend y'all's thoughts and how you come up with this. Like, it sounds like a really great books. yeah, just listening to you, I'm thinking, how in the world do they come up with all this creativity and this, this book? It blows my mind. I envy you for that. So, seriously, how your brain works, I can't even barely comprehend it. So I'm sitting back in my laptop, and I'm having to even ask my boyfriend because he knows more about this than I do. And wow, can I say that? Just wow on what you can even put into a book and your writing. And I wish I had your mindset on your brain, actually. I wish we were capable of even sharing that, because I just wish I was as smart as you all are. I'm happy I'm very happy I joined into this because I learned a little bit about it. I'm still trying to comprehend it, to be completely honest. But yeah, wow, just wow.
Well, the book is available on Amazon. I got it from Amazon. I'm supposed to hold it closer to Athena there. Uh, it's written in nice short chapters, so you can feel like, even if you've just got a little bit of time, you can just read one chapter, at a time, or sometimes, when you can't sleep at night, like I often can't, several go by very quickly. And it's just, it's wise and challenging, and at first you have to keep flipping to the glossary in the back to like, what does this word mean again? But all science fiction writers have to make up words. It's just sort of par for the course, par for the genre.
Modified physics.
And modified physics, David says, yes.
In terms of, just to say, Leah, that I do have a rather unusual career behind me that drives this. I mean, although I was trained as an astrophysicist, I ended up doing research across a range of disciplines that includes the social sciences, the arts, the health sciences, as well as the physical sciences and computing. So over the course of my career, I developed an extensive knowledge across a range of disciplines and understanding of the world and the universe. And all that went into the books, right? So it's kind of, I have an unfair advantage in a way over young people because I have a whole career of doing this stuff behind me, so.
My boyfriend even mentioned, he said that it sounds like there's also the end of the movie, Mission to Mars, also has a similar technology as liquid transport to people. He heard you talking about that in the beginning, and of course he's way more educated than I am. So all this is more in his realm. And I'm thinking, all right, you gotta sit in with me on this, like listen to this, because I think he can, I think his mind goes that way too. And I try my hardest to have him kind of educate me in a way that I can even comprehend coming from him. So that's what he said, that it reminded him of Mission to Mars in that sense.
Well, I am again feeling the imagination. What is imagination? What is actually happening when we use the term, with the term we apply, imagination? And yes, the vastness, as Leah is saying, of your imagination as the author bringing this about. But then also, I mean, that seems to me something of what you say is the value of doing this, the importance of doing this. Certainly in a Jungian discussion, we do just fine to speak of the importance of imagination, a central importance of imagination.
I would add to that the collective unconscious, because when I was writing my novel, there was, you know, when the imagination was kind of operating on its own without much of, you know, my ego getting involved, there's like a tapping into a collective unconscious that at the time I didn't even have that word. I didn't know what was going on. Stuff was just, you know, coming into my imagination. And it wasn't until after my book was published that I realized that some of those instances had been tapping into a collective unconscious, because I was getting information that I had no idea it was real. You know, it's like I found out later it was real, but at the time I just thought I was making it all up. Did you ever have any experiences like that, you know, when, as you've been writing?
I think any writer does too. I mean, one is often a channel for some energy comes elsewhere that passes through you in the best of times. Sometimes it's a struggle, and every word is an issue, but there are many times where it just flows. And I think, is it me, or is it, you know, I mean, is another spiritual discussion if we want, but
Yeah, well, actually, I was, you know, when I was reading about, you know, this connection, which you just described as a kind of field, what was going through my mind was the collective unconscious. Oh, is this what it looks like when we're all completely tapped into our collective unconscious?
Well, where that leads me, just in a stream of consciousness, is to the people you work with. I mean, did you create the background that we've enjoyed this evening? Did you create that, or?
No, that was created by a student of mine, the same one who did the cover design for the book.
And then thinking of the opera and thinking of various other extensions of imagination, so that if we want to talk about how these patterns are emerging from the unconscious, or shall we say the unknown, and imagination is a conduit from the unknown, the unformed, into form. And certainly what you're working with is very, very opening, very freeing. And I think that's one of the values for me this evening, is just, and it was, which was the premise I believe stated, was the importance of imagining the future. And I often get so down and depressed about it that I get sort of stuck with, you know, how are we even going to get to any future at all? Which I know that's not ultimately, I don't stay stuck there, but I have to work with it. I have to work with it. It's my materia. And when I look at young people, and you made comments about that earlier as well, which leads me always to my reference to my grandchildren, who range in age from not quite 1 to 11, and I look at them and I think, wow, I don't know how good I can be at all about imagining with them, and so this has helped me, every aspect, all the patterns you're working with, your process, very opening and very freeing for me personally. Opening to.
And you're right. It is. I mean, it's one of the interesting things about the project is people have climbed onto the project. I mean, the fashion show I did, I worked with textile designer. I worked with the musicians for the opera as well. So, you know, I've had maybe upwards of 20 to 30 people who've taken on different parts of work in relation to this project. The fact that Infinite Conversations and the Untimely Books have agreed to publish all 15 books. This is unheard of in the publication industry. Nobody agrees to publish 15 books. You know, the reason it works is because it's working under a cooperative principle whose goal is to make available the work of the co-op's members to the public. And so it's a different kind of arrangement. But it's still, I'm incredibly lucky to have rolled into a situation where all these people have signed on to help me, you know, make this thing come out. So I think the project is, whether it's overly ambitious, maybe time will tell, but its ambition has partly helped bring on people and the openness. I'm still looking for ways to, well, one of the preoccupations I have is how can I get readers more involved in the actual, in the creative process? Can I find mechanisms where readers can be involved? In the opera, we had the audience, we asked the audience to sing along with the singers at the very end of the opera, and their singing helped the main character deal with her issue at the very end of the opera. So it was a way to involve the audience into the creative process. I'm still looking for ways to do that with the novels. I don't know quite how to do it yet, but I am looking for that. So that's because I think we're in a time where people need to be able to participate.
Yeah, and also I think to be encouraged to imagine the future they want to live into. You know, Hollywood throws at us, you know, all these apocalyptic movies about the future that, frankly, I would not want a future like that. But given the way, you know, the human imagination and manifestation into reality occur, we tend to bring into existence what we imagine. And so, you know, imagining a different kind of world, I think anyway, you know, will help us bring it about. But if we want to keep imagining, you know, Blade Runner,
Well,
I'll be dead, hopefully.
and I want to say that
I wanted to say that I think a science fiction writer has to be very careful about what they write because so much of it comes to fruition. And just think about Wells and Verne and all these great imaginative minds that
The Jetsons. We are speaking on Zoom because of the Jetsons.
Or Dick Tracy.
Dick Tracy, that's right. He had the ring first.
Yeah, but yeah, watch here.
Yeah.
I'm speaking on my Dick Tracy watch right now. What I wanted to say though is keep pushing the boundaries, keep pushing the imagination where you're going, because you're going into areas which I would say very few people have attempted to go because of your experience and background and knowledge in these areas. And you're pushing, you know, your imagination is based upon more reality than most. And it'll go places that most of us has never thought about, and that very useful in helping us to change our minds about the future.
Yeah, agree. That's why I think we need to write more utopias, more or heterotopias, whatever, but less dystopias, because we need to imagine the future, and the way to do that is through science fiction. So,
Yeah.
I also think the notion of doing what one can do with the resources one has in outreach to those with whom one can do it. In other words, for you to say that you're working with a group of, what, 30 people, and you have an outreach, and in my view, not a mega colossal, highly packaged process, although good things can be done. I mean, Disney can do great things, actually. I think Disney can do great things. But I think for me, the importance of actually what we're doing here right now, having a conversation in good faith, I'll put that in there, and saying, how can we experience imagination together, just to get us right back to what you were saying, and that this is important. So, I'm very grateful for your time and energy in staying up till very late in Quebec City, or wherever you are.
On whatever planet. Or
Whatever
This is,
star system.
this is Pinnacle, which is what, about 70 light years from the Earth.
Well, that
That's
feels
not
all
too
right.
far.
Yeah, that feels pretty good.
It's our backyard, kind of.
Well, I want to just call the time. We do stop at 9, but we don't necessarily all go away at 9. But I am going to stop the